Okay, is everyone ready for me to switch on start webinar?
Yes, Grant.
Yep,
Right.
ready to go.
Stand by.
Hello, everybody. Welcome. Thanks for joining us today for the webinar from the INSITE program. This is the fourth in our series now. The topic today will be on cumulative impacts assessment. As you can see, some of the panel are well, all of our panel are here online. So I'll just get us started and then introduce the speakers. My name is Henk van Rijn. I am on the INSITE program director team. And I'm going to introduce the webinar today. So before we go into the presentations, I just wanted to make a point about the use of science in decision making. And really, it ties in the role of government who make decisions and are challenged with multiple competing interests quite often, and their decisions need to be made sort of transparent. They need to be made clearly in an accountable, proportionate way. And this is where the science can really help. So science can play a critical role in informing that decision making and enabling action, particularly identifying alternatives, clarifying the costs and the benefits of particular courses of action so that the policymakers in the government, for example, can choose between them. So now the INSITE program has been looking at some of the fundamental science questions needed to understand and influence the influence and the value of structures in the marine environment over the last 10 years. What we've been doing in the INSITE program over the last few months, and will continue to do, is to work closely with policymakers to identify where INSITE science can support their work. So INSITE is coming to the end of its second phase now, and many of you will more than likely already be familiar with the program, but it is worth saying that when INSITE was first set up, it was the first real joint industry partnership of its kind in UK marine research. Its aim has always been to provide stakeholders with independent scientific evidence that can be used to better understand the influence of man-made structures in the ecosystems of the North Sea. We have quite a lot of projects. We've had a lot of projects over the phase two. I'm not going to go through this slide in detail. You can read it yourself. But generally speaking, we've been looking at foraging by marine predators, testing the limits of the UK's autonomous fleet, understanding fish aggregation, blue carbon benefits. We've been developing AI to speed up the understanding of biodiversity associated with marine structures, and more recently investigating the effects and implications of subsea plastics incorporated into marine structures. Now, as I said, today's webinar is focused on cumulative effects assessments, and these are defined by the OSPAR Commission as a systematic procedure for identifying and evaluating the significance of effects from multiple human activities. It can also provide an estimate of the overall expected impact in order to inform management decisions. The analysis of the causes, pathways of exposure, and the consequences of these effects on ecosystem components is an essential and integral part of the cumulative effects assessment process. So to start us off and introduce the topic, we're very fortunate to have Dr. Ashton Lannon, who's the head of the Marine Management Organizations and Evidence Team. She'll provide us with some background work on what the MMO do and some wider context on the importance of cumulative effects assessment there. We'll then hear from our INSITE investigators. Now, we've unfortunately, Dr. Krisha Mazik, who was originally billed, is not able to make it today. But very fortunately, we have our very own Ed Wilstead coming in at the 11th hour from Hull Marine Consulting. Thanks, Ed. Following on from Ed, we have Dr. Anthony Knight from the University of Plymouth, talking to us a little bit about the DREAMS and the Synthesis project, and then handing over to Dr. Owen O'Gorman, who is from the University of Essex, and we'll be chatting a little bit about the FWECOMS project. Finally, I will host a short question and answer session towards the end of the webinar, in which there'll be an opportunity to ask our panel, our speakers, some of the questions that you might have for their about their talks today. You'll all be muted throughout the webinar, but you can ask these questions using the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screens. You can upvote these using a thumbs up icon, and we will try to answer all of those at the end of the webinar. One final note, as we just before we go on to our first speaker, is that in addition to the webinar being recorded, we also have a live illustration being carried out alongside all the talks and the Q&A session. So we will give you glimpses of this as we go along, and the final images will be available via our website, along with all of the recordings. So at this point, I will hand you over to Dr. Ashton Lannon from the Marine Management Organization.
Thank you very much, Hank, and thanks everybody. It's really great to be here and to be talking to you. At the MMO, we are the regulator that is responsible for planning, marine planning, for licensing most of the things that happen in the sea. Some of the large infrastructure projects are a bit bigger than us, so it's the planning inspectorate that deals with them, but we are still quite a big part of that process. We are also responsible for licensing and managing all the fishing activity that goes on in the sea, though we work in collaboration with the inshore fisheries conservation authorities to do that, and they have specific regional responsibilities in the 0 to 12 nautical mile area. We're also responsible for managing the marine protected areas and for making sure that within those protected areas, the biodiversity of specific elements is maintained. And although it's easy to set out those things, actually to do that job well, we need to interlink, integrate, and manage those things in conjunction with each other. And that is much harder to do than to say. And when the MMO was set up in 2010, and I joined the organization soon after that, we wrote an evidence strategy which set out what it was the MMO needed to know to do its job. We had 6 very high level categories, and to illustrate why I'm telling you this, those categories covered things like fisheries management, data, and, would you believe, cumulative effects was its own category. So cumulative effects was deemed such an important thing that the MMO had its own category and its own funding stream and its own work program related to cumulative effects. And I think that's a good thing. It was the right thing, because the cumulative impact of all the activities that we manage in English seas is a really important and a big responsibility. However, the way that cumulative effects and impacts were approached was to think about it from quite a specific activity-based, pressure-based, ecological viewpoint. And I think that we've evolved quite a bit from that. But I would suggest that we haven't evolved enough. I think there are still things that we really need to fundamentally discuss in terms of where cumulative effects sits within the context of achieving the government's objectives, what I think are all of our objectives, actually, to restore the marine environment, to deal with climate change, to increase biodiversity, while also living and operating as a species that relates very closely to the marine environment. So I think it's a tough topic, is what I'm trying to say. And I know a little bit of the research that's going to be presented here today, and I think that it's very useful and valuable, and it makes a contribution, and that there is something about this collective coming together to talk even more about where cumulative effects fits in our context. And I say that because we have to make decisions now that are based on much more complex information, which is a good thing. It's actually very positive, because we have to consider not just lessening the impact of what's happening, but also doing this restoration and improvement work. There's a complex set of objectives we need to achieve. And cumulative effects, by its very nature, is a system-based approach. I'm not sure if we're covering all the system in the way we're approaching it at the moment, and that's what I'm interested in, because it should be a very interdisciplinary approach, and I don't know how well we're doing that just yet. But I'm really interested in how these scientists are beginning to bring that together and to talk about it much more, and then where that fits in terms of a kind of a framework of decision-making we have that is that has multiple levels and operates on multiple spaces, and when I say multiple levels, I mean at different decision-making points, because there are lots of different decision makers. The MMO isn't the only one, and how we bring all of that together. And that, for me, is the beauty of bringing science and policy together, is to take this wonderful thinking and experimentation that's going on and modeling, and to bring that together with the reality of what we must achieve for ourselves and for nature, and the process by which we do that. I think that was all I was going to say, if that's okay, Henk. If there's anything else you think that I've missed that I should touch on, then you should let me know.
Thank you, Aislinn. No, that's great and well said. You know, I think you've outlined that it's complex. There are lots of different factors that need to be incorporated, and it's been something that we've been working on for quite a while now, isn't it? So thank you very much. And I think that leads on really nicely to our first science speaker, Dr. Ed Wilstead of Howell Marine Consulting, who's going to build on what Aislinn's just started there and elaborate quite a bit, sort of framing what is sort of cumulative effects assessment and what are the sort of challenges, that it imposes on us and why it's important. So over to you, Ed.
Thanks, Hank, and thanks, Aislinn. That gave me a bit of confidence, actually, that what I'm about to sort of like present, having sort of like dropped onto this at late notice, is going to be somewhat sort of like on topic, which is good news. So bear with me while I get up the presentation. So let me get this going. Right. If I can just stop that, because I've got too many videos up there. Is that all right? Can everyone still hear me okay?
Yes.
Brilliant. Okay, thanks. So, right, I'm going to be talking about the cumulative effects assessment and the gap that is sort of fairly obvious, I think, between science and practice. And as noticed, I've dropped onto this at short notice, so excuse it if it's slightly rough around the edges. So, yeah, I'm Ed Wilstead. In the next 10 minutes, I'm going to be introducing two concepts. There we go. So two sort of scientific dimensions, which are sort of fundamental to assessing cumulative effects that present significant challenges to scientists, to practitioners and decision makers alike. And I'll touch on why the standard approaches that we rely on to assess cumulative effects are being slightly provocative and not fit for purpose, and outline the kind of system that we might need to think about if we're going to be tackling cumulative effects. So firstly, just a quick thing, why should we be concerned about cumulative effects? And the critical thing here is that if we're concerned about sustainable development, we're concerned about cumulative effects. So cumulative effects are increasing. And this is Halpin's paper, sort of like the update that came out in 2015, which is basically indicating sort of where there's a sort of like an increase in cumulative effects around the globe. And the things that we care about, that fish, dolphins, pandas, people, doesn't matter. All those things don't experience stresses and isolation, and instead the resilience of a population of porpoises or of a fishing community or of a business reflect the consequences of multiple causal agents which are acting on those entities over spatial and temporal scales that are defined by those entities. Cumulative effects assessment should support decision making by systematically identifying and evaluating the significance of effects from multiple activities to provide an evidenced assessment of the expected impact. And the other critical point is that should be informing the management measures that come after that. So far, so good. So why isn't this happening? And the two things that I'm going to introduce are basically complexity and the issue of scale. And as Ashley mentioned, this is sort of set within systems. So the other part is that we need to bear in mind within systems, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. So first, let's deal with complexity. So let's say we've got a development question. How is my development going to affect fish stocks? And we're going to take herring as an example because I spent a significant amount of time researching herring, so I happen to have some graphics up my sleeve. So what are the factors that affect herring production? So we need to know when we're thinking about the resilience and when we're thinking about sensitivity to particular impacts, we need to know a bit about the biology. And at its most basic, there are two kind of critical factors with herring, with fish, which are sort of like recruitment of new fish into the population and the growth of surviving fish. So then when we start sort of looking into some of the variables that influence those, we start seeing that we're sort of developing dependencies, we're developing relationships. There are other things that sort of feed into those two sort of basic factors, and we can start seeing some feedback loops building in. So on the left-hand side there, you've got a reinforcing loop. On the right-hand side, you can see a balancing loop. And then, of course, we've got the sort of like the natural mortality that's on top of that. Now, the ecology is also relevant. So we need to start thinking about what food is available. We need to start thinking about what's eating the herring. And we need to think about sort of specific life cycle stages, which are sort of particularly relevant to the herring as well. And in this case, it's the availability of spawning habitat. And now when we start to add in the human activities that impact resilience, the main thing that we think of is fishing. But there's a range of other sort of activities which can have sort of direct impacts. It can also have indirect impacts on elements of the herring lifestyle. For example, here by impacting on the spawning ground, the quality and the extent of the spawning grounds that are there. And then if we really throw the kitchen sink at it, then you can add in climate change to the mix. Now, if we then sort of build this into what becomes a sort of like a full causal loop model, this neatly sort of demonstrates, the only sort of neat thing about this diagram, the neat thing that it demonstrates is that this is complex. So there is complexity, we can't hide from it. We need to think about these things in terms of systems. So for example, understanding the significance of the noise, which is generated by piling of offshore wind turbine foundations, requires comprehension of what else is happening to the herring to be able to understand the actual significance of a particular activity on that population. And while this diagram looks daunting, firstly, we've got lots of information about many of the variables. And secondly, arguably, we don't need information about all of the variables. The problem is that lots of the information is considered in isolation. So the next thing to introduce and just touch on is this concept of scale, and particularly when we're thinking about this in terms of cumulative effects. So we've got spatial scales and we've got temporal scales. So continuing with the theme of herring, the image on the left-hand side there is just the relevant sort of spawning grounds and habitat for particular phases of herring within the sort of Thames estuary region. And then, of course, it kind of goes around the North Sea, and it's got a whole, vast extent, a geographical range over which it's receiving some form of causal agent happening on that population across its life, the lifespan, and also across that geographical range. And there's a lot of activity which is happening in our seas, and some of it has some effect on herring. So to avoid a death by 1,000 cuts, we need to have some comprehension of what's happening over the extent which is defined by the herring, so the spatial extents which are defined by the entity that we're concerned with. Now, the next point is temporal scale, and this is one where if you look at cumulative effects assessments, time, and I'm talking particularly about ones which are used within decision making, so EIAs, SEAs, and things like that. The time is very often a sort of a neglected part of this, but it's critical. So here, again, we can see sort of like the change in the population and the spawning stock biomass of a particular population of herring. And you can see that it's changed substantially over time, so between 1981 and 2016. And the point here is that the consequences of the same activity at those two arrows, which I've just put up there, are going to be quite different. It can be the same activity, the same sort of amount of noise energy put into the environment, for example, but the potential impact, the significance of that is going to be substantially different over time. So we need to have access to data that provides us with a time series of how populations have changed over time. So I've said that assessing cumulative effects is complicated, and yes, if we're seeking to a comprehensive answer all in one go, that is certainly true. The scale of the task is daunting. And this is one of my favorite quotes that articulates beautifully why cumulative effects assessment is hard. And I think this is also one of the reasons that practitioners struggle, and scientists as well. Scientific knowledge, as we all know, sort of builds incrementally, but we haven't got a system that underpins cumulative effects assessment, that supports the iterative nature that we need, that spans the scales that are relevant to managing cumulative effects. So what is the current assessment system? And I mentioned before that the system of assessing cumulative effects that most nations rely on, especially in the marine environment, is not working. So decision-making about development is very often informed by environmental impact assessments, EIAs, and to a lesser extent, strategic environmental assessments. And I mentioned two reasons why we're not delivering meaningful cumulative effects assessment at the moment. Firstly, because there is that complexity, and secondly, because the whole is greater than the sum of the parts and the scales that we need to look at and to bring in that systems thinking. And I hope I've conveyed that cumulative effects assessment requires a broader perspective. So considering one activity in isolation is not going to give you a robust assessment. We know from complex adaptive systems theory and from practice as well that making decisions based on an understanding of one piece of the puzzle without reference to the wider context leads to environmental degradation. And I'm going to be provocative and say that that's precisely what EIA, and to a lesser extent SEA, do. EIAs and most SEAs consider isolated effects on isolated receptors, but what we need is an assessment system that spans across the range and the life cycle of receptors. The other point that sort of comes in here is that we're sort of making inquiries into better practice through various streams. There's a lot of work going on in the scientific sphere. We've got EIAs, which contribute sort of high resolution data sets at particular scales. We've got lots of things which are inquiring into cumulative effects assessments, but they're not necessarily speaking the same language. So one of the issues that we've got, and particularly going back to the issue with EIAs, they provide answers that the planning system knows how to handle. But I'd argue that given what we know about cumulative effects, EIAs are actually providing the answers to the wrong question. Now, this wouldn't be so much of an issue if we had a system which was coherent and able to sort of take these lines of inquiry and put it into something coherent across the scales and in terms of the information collected, and if it was being fed into a strategic system. Which brings me on to the last point. What sort of system do we need to assess cumulative effects? So to deal with the variables, we need consistent information about those variables, or at least about the significant variables that we can manage. And that requires an assessment system that has longevity, including a funding, that includes multiple compatible data sets at appropriate scales. And we need reliable long-term data sets that can overcome the problem of shifting baselines and a strategic perspective that is independent of one activity. So regional strategic approaches are essential to determine the significance of project impacts as well as of policies and plans. As noted, there is great value in high-resolution assessments too, such as those provided by EIAs, but I contend that EIAs should be repurposed to be cumulative effects assessments that feed into a strategic assessment process. We also need a system which is allied to adaptive management, where increasing knowledge and capacity support policymakers and delivery partners. And then finally, I just note that managing cumulative effects requires that political and ecological scales are brought into better alignment. We need cumulative effects assessments that specifically focus on delivering existing marine and coastal policy. And one of the issues is we have fragmented policy at the moment. So to conclude, cumulative effects assessment is tough. We've got complexity, we've got greater spatial scales, we've got extended timescales that all present significant challenges. But I'd argue that we've got more than enough scientific knowledge to apply sort of risk-based approaches to do better. And the final point is just that the challenge, I think, the bigger task really relates to the policy and delivery challenges that are actually illuminated by doing cumulative effects assessment. Thanks.
Thank you, Ed. Thank you very much. Really interesting thoughts that you raised there about some of the existing assessment approaches that are being used, but also sort of how those could be considered being brought together, and then some of the challenges there. And it's like you've laid the gauntlet down in terms of sort of where you think we need to go there. So thank you for raising all that. I think it'd be interesting now to move on to our next speaker, Dr. Anthony Knights from University of Plymouth, who will be following on from Ed, but now looking at sort of a review of the current cumulative effects assessment approaches that have been out there, and seeing what they've found with respect to considering the effects of man-made structures at sea. So thank you, Ed, and moving on to Tony, please.
All right. Hello, everyone. I think hopefully start my video. Ooh. I think, Eileen, if you could start my video, that would be handy. I'm blocked out. Oh, start video. There we go. All right. Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for joining this webinar today. My name is Anthony Knights. I'm an Associate Professor of Marine Ecology at the University of Plymouth. I'm also the co-PI of two projects funded by INSITE, first of which is something called the DREAMS project, which is related to decommissioning options of offshore man-made structures. And the other one is a synthesis project, which is looking to draw together evidence from around the world with respect to different decommissioning options and what might be some of the choices we might want to consider in light of existing international policy. So I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about that today, and thinking about some of the pressures and effects that are associated with artificial structures and some of the multiple environmental targets that we have worldwide. I'd also just like to acknowledge a couple of co-authors in particular, Anel Lemasson and Paul Summerfield. So Anel's a postdoc with me in Plymouth, and Paul's at Plymouth Marine Laboratory, as well as all of the other people that help make this work possible. So to start with, so what's the challenge? Well, we've got thousands of artificial structures in the sea, as many of you will know, and many of these are coming towards the end of life and requiring insights on what we actually do with them. In terms of the policy landscape currently, there's a number of different scales at which you can look at this from. Internationally, we have the Geneva Convention, the United Nations Law of the Sea, as well as the International Management Organization guidelines, as well as regional decisions like the Oslo-Paris Agreement, Decision 98.3 from 1998, as well as other local or kind of national laws, which effectively mean that structures in the sea require complete removal. There are some derogations to this, and those derogations typically are related to the size of structures or the types of structures in terms of their construction and associated hazards with removing them. But in general, the position is to completely remove them. although that's in the context of the wider issues around decommissioning. Certainly other places like the US have certainly pioneered rigs to reefs and looking to transfer reefs and platforms into reefs for maintenance of biodiversity. So what we do know, though, and where this links to today's webinar, is that actually the structures that are currently in place create a multitude of pressures and effects. And the question is to what extent can decommissioning options, of which I'll talk about shortly, can result in optimal environmental and societal outcomes. Problem with that is that actually there isn't a huge amount of evidence actually available for decommissioning in terms of assessing what option might be best. There's a lot of indirect evidence where we could look at assessing the effects of those structures indirectly, but they're typically as a result of the age of many of these structures. The EIA process wasn't really in place at the time, which required this sort of before or after control assessment or impact assessment to really be undertaken to allow us to really pull apart what the benefits or costs of different decommissioning options were. So what we did within the INSITE program that we were funded by was to actually try and draw on some scientific consensus based on expertise and expert judgment to first of all assess what the different pressures and effects might be. So we drew together a team of 36 scientists from around the world, from 4 different continents, 30 different academic and government institutions, and so on. And we undertook a process called an exposure and effect assessment. And the graphic here on the right hand side kind of illustrates what this process really does. It thinks about these sorts of impact we refer to as impact change, where we think about a particular sector or an activity or a structure in this case, and how that then generates some form of pressure, effectively a mechanism through which either harm or change is caused to the environment, and then subsequently what that effect on that environment or ecosystem component might be. And we asked individuals to actually assess each of these different components, and we looked at this in 2 ways. We looked at it in terms of impact, and this is on the left-hand side of the figure that's shown on the screen here. So we're looking at the severity of those effects, so how harmful is a particular pressure in this case, how frequent is it, and what's its scale of that effect. And that can then be amalgamated into this integrated assessment of impacts. So this is building very much on a risk basis. And then subsequently, we're thinking about the kind of post decommissioning options is what's the duration of some of those impacts and what are the environmental and societal costs and benefits of making a particular choice. So we asked our 36 scientists to tell us what they felt about these different range of pressures, and then we converted that to a score to allow us to analyze these data. I'm not going to go into it too much more detail than what is shown on the screen here, because to be frank, there is lots and lots of data as a result of these workshops that we used. But in the top right here, you can see there's an illustration of, in this case, a series of pressures that we assessed: chemical contamination, connectivity, electromagnetic fields, and so on. And on the y-axis here, we've got these different effects that we looked at, so the downstream effects of these different pressures. And for each of these, we applied these scores, like I said, where in this case, the scores are based on a scale of effect, basically. So an effect size. So if a score of 1 is negligible effect, and then everything up to a 4 is a large effect in this case. And the colors represent kind of the scales, with the error bars really showing the variation in the response and the mean kind of position based on everyone's answers. But to summarize all of that, well, in this integrated synthesis here, I've got two kind of rows or panels here, really. On the top row here, we have the pressure data. So this is looking at the different pressures, and this is grouped by the impact. So this is the effect of the pressure in this case, the kind of the severity of it, if you will. And on the right hand side, we've got the cost and benefit of those. When we're dealing with the impact scores, what we see here is that if the score is bigger, it's effectively saying that the effect is more severe, more frequent, and over larger spatial scales. So everything to the right of the plots here are potentially worse. And then in terms of the cost and benefit here, the dotted line here that's shown on the screen, in this case, everything to the right of the dotted line, so a positive score, indicates that the effect or pressure is desirable, and everything to the left indicates that it's considered undesirable by those scientists. And we did the same thing for the effects. And really the take-home message here is that I want you to see is that, across the range of pressures, you have kind of generally similar impacts. So often they're relatively large scale, relatively severe, and relatively frequent for many of these things. But we see some differences, and some pressures are considered less impactful. For example, electromagnetic fields are considered to be less important, perhaps, than changes in connectivity or food availability. But similarly, in terms of the actual costs and benefits of those pressures, thinking about actually what they then lead to in terms of effects, we see that things like the provision of primary productivity through food, changes in connectivity, for example, are kind of more or less desirable, or certainly not considered undesirable, whereas kind of other things like chemical contamination, as you might expect, noise and so on, and light are considered to be undesirable pressures. And then if we look at the effects, we can look at that in the same way. So we can look at, for example, we're seeing kind of the effect of these different pressures on the way in which we manage our seas is obviously pretty important in this case. For example, creation of de facto MPAs or other effects arising from structures, down to the effects of mortality on species, for example, and considered less important. And similarly, a number of effects as a result of structures, so that these are the structures in place are considered to be beneficial to the environment, for example, in how we might manage the system, changes in population dynamics, provision of habitat and biodiversity maintenance are considered to be better things as a result of these structures remaining in the sea. But the things that are considered bad, are the kind of the pollution, the disturbance, the habitat loss, potential for dispersal, assisted dispersal of non-native species, for example, are some of these costs and benefit, some of the costs or undesirable effects associated with these structures. So effectively, the take-home message here is that there is a diversity of pressures and effects, some of which are considered to be desirable, others that are undesirable. So what do we keep and what do we want to lose? Well, ultimately, that then becomes a political decision in terms of what people might wish to consider to be the effects that we might want to keep and those that we might wish to lose. Although we did see general consensus in the opinion about the pros and cons of those different effects. Although we did see local differences in some of those effects. So, for example, in California, for example, the effects of reef structures as a decommissioning option are considered to be positive, whereas perhaps in the North Sea and local participants from those areas are perhaps less favourable of those structures being in the sea in those areas for various reasons. But you can see in this case, this plot really is illustrating that actually there's a number of pressures and effects which some people might like to keep, like food availability affecting population size and stability of ecosystems, for example, and population dynamics, but things like chemical contamination people might wish to lose. So the question is, which of those do we want to keep? And again, that then becomes a manager's decision based on that. And the purpose of this assessment is really to give a transparent understanding of what the pros and cons of different options might be. So we then went on to then look at, well, what are those pros and cons in terms of and how that might influence or change our perception of existing legislation and policy. So clearly, man-made structures are both negative and positive for the environment and society with this diversity of desirable and undesirable effects. But what it effectively tells us is there isn't any strong support for policy change, whether that's to remove structures or whether to retain them, until we actually have better evidence. And what we actually found, and one of the kind of key take-home messages, is we're asking whether or not actually these decisions that we might make with respect to future decommissioning might be placed on a case-by-case basis that might account for localized trade-offs in costs and benefits at a local level. So to kind of then bring this slightly broader, so of these different decommissioning options that we have available to us, and the graphic on the right here illustrates a number of the options that are commonly used. We looked at these different options and linked them to existing kind of strategic goals under the UN, the Future We Want, the Sustainable Development Goals, as well as the OSPAR Regional North East Atlantic Strategy. And we looked to see what effect these different decommissioning options might have on moving towards or alternatively away from those different strategic outcomes. So we looked at a number of decommissioning options like I've just shown you in the previous figure. And what you can see here on this graph is A to E in this case are decommissioning options that focus on managing single structures, and F to L here is the management of multiple structures. And this looking at a number of different pressures. There's 6 of those 10 pressures that we looked at, just shown here just for clarity. But again here, everything to the right of the dotted line indicates that a pressure in this case as a result of a particular decommissioning option is enhanced, and anything to the left of the dotted line indicates that that pressure might be reduced. And what you can kind of take home from this is that irrespective of which decommissioning option you take, in the most part, pressures are reduced. So remove all structures and you're going to get a reduction in a lot of those pressures, whether it's chemical contamination, noise, light, or so on. But often we might see increases in other human activities. For example, it might be that the fishing access to different areas, which ordinarily might have been excluded as a result of those structures creating navigational hazards, might have excluded them. So there's changes in the way in which those sectors might use those systems. So what do we conclude in terms of which of these options might be best? Well, very briefly, we found that, or certainly the consensus from the scientists was that actually of all of those different options, which are shown here on the graph, to either repurpose or abandon individual structures, or alternatively to abandon multiple structures, give us the most strong contribution towards those 35 environmental targets that were outlined in those different strategy documents. But what was also clear was that some of those targets are likely not to be met. So in some cases, some of the targets will be met based on using these, choosing one of these 3 options, but equally others may also fail. So there again, there'll be a political choice about actually which of those options might be best. And that might be, again, on a local basis. And ultimately, what this really does represent is a fundamental difference in approach to the current policy of complete removal. And this is certainly supporting some previous calls to suggest that we maybe reconsider that the derogation approach that we currently apply under the OSPAR and United Nations rules, but very much on a case-by-case basis. So I'll leave it there, and I'd just like, again, to thank the 36 scientists who did contribute to the workshops of that, and a number of other funding bodies, and I'm very happy to take any questions once Owen has given his talk. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Tony. Great talk. Really, really interesting stuff. Fascinating analysis as well. And I know that your projects are continuing over the next number of months, so I think we'll see further additions to that. I've got some questions for you, but I'm going to save those for the very end. And I use this moment to highlight that we do have the question and answer tab there. So please, as you're listening, if you've got any questions for our speakers, please put them in there. And it's worth pausing for a moment and having a quick look at what our illustrator has come up with so far from listening to all of our talks. And as you can see, the image is growing. It's really cool. Getting all of, like, a lot of key messages are coming out. It's really, really cool. Thank you, Katie. Okay, we'll move on now to our final science speaker for the webinar, Dr. Owen Gorman from from University of Essex. Who's going to elaborate a little bit on some of the more specific approaches that are scientific approaches that are used and can underpin cumulative effects assessments. So over to you, Owen.
Thanks very much, Hank, and great to be here to chat to you all today. So I'm more or less the spokesperson for some excellent work that's been done by one of my PhD students, Ellen Chen, on the impact of man-made structures on benthic invertebrate diversity, biomass, and food web properties. And just to acknowledge some of his co-supervisors from CFAS and the university, and also some of the other members of our FUCOMS team, the project funded through the INSITE program led by Natalie Hicks. So I probably don't need to convince in this particular audience why we should study the impact of man-made structures and on benthic communities in particular, but it is a major anthropogenic stressor that can lead to, of course, contamination and physical disturbance, but there are potentially benefits to the marine environment as well that might fall under things like artificial reefs or fish shelter and habitats. And one of my particular interests is in food web ecology, and it's notable that there are very few studies dedicated to food web assessment of the impact of man-made structures. And that's particularly important for benthic food webs, because benthic invertebrates living in the sediment may be particularly vulnerable to the impact of man-made structures. And they also play very important roles in ecosystem processes and functioning of the ecosystem associated with those regions. So when I talk about food webs, this is a very simplified version of what Zelen has been looking at. Many of Zelen's webs will have over 100 species, thousands of links, so because he's resolved all the species that belong to each of these trophic groups that you see in the picture. But it illustrates the point that you have this vertical structure as well, that biomass and diversity are not just one metric, but they're sort of spread throughout the food web. You have predators that feed on primary consumers like grazers and detritivores, which also feed on the basal resources that are present at the bottom of the food web. And it can be interesting to see if there are particular parts of the food web that are more affected by anthropogenic stressors than others. So for instance, maybe predators might be more susceptible because they rely on resources beneath them. And if those resources disappear, well, there could be knock-on effects up the food web, if you like. And it's interesting from that perspective to see where stressors might be affecting the food web, and also how the overall structure of the system is changing, because there are many stabilizing features provided by that overall food web structure, such as the complexity or the connectance of the system. So how well is it connected? How much redundancy is there in the feeding pathways and energy pathways within the network? And what's the overall sort of length of food chains, which can be a really good indicator of the health or the productivity of a system. So some of the key research questions we're interested in addressing in this study were: how could we use hydrocarbon data to identify the distance over which man-made structure impacts occur? How do diversity and biomass of benthic invertebrates respond to the commencement of oil production? And are there similar responses throughout the food web, or particular areas or compartments that might be most affected? In terms of the data that Zelen's been looking at, he managed to identify 553 sampling sites from 9 man-made structures where there was data collected on, species in the environment, and also environmental data like hydrocarbons, heavy metal concentrations, and other environmental characteristics as well, both before and after the commencement of oil began, and at different distances away from the structures. He's also spent some time compiling benthic invertebrate body mass data for all the species in the data set from work done by colleagues at CFAS, and also sourcing the interactions of who eats who within the food web from literature research. So just to show you what the concentration of total hydrocarbons might look like before commencement of oil production in blue, and after the commencement of oil production in red, at different distances away from the structure, you begin to see a clear, what we call impact zone in the first 500 meters close to a man-made structure, where after the production of oil begins, you can see a very clear increase in background concentrations on a log 10 scale, so even more dramatic than they might appear in this figure. So for our analysis, we consider all the samples collected after the production of oil within that first 500 meters as the true sort of impact for our analysis. Rather than drawing a hard line that says everything beyond that is a kind of a background control, we allow a sort of a gray area where you can see some sort of maybe oddities or deviations in terms of the concentrations of oil. And we consider that to be 500 to 1500 meters away from the structure. And all the samples collected after commencement of oil, we consider that as a buffer zone. And then for everything else, 1500 meters away from the structure, we see indistinguishable concentrations between the before and the after. And so all the samples taken after consider as the control, but also all the samples taken before, no matter where they are in relation to the structure, are considered as sort of a temporal control to control for background noise or differences through time that might occur through more natural processes. So when we analyze the data available to us along this idea of the impact buffer and control segments of our sort of quasi-experimental design, we can see clear increases in the concentrations of a whole suite of different hydrocarbon compounds like normal alkanes, low molecular weight polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, and high molecular weight PAHs as well, all much higher in the impact relative to both the buffer and the control. So just to explain, within this figure, when two letters are different from one another, that means there's a significant difference between the treatments. So the impact here with the letter A is significantly higher than both the buffer and the control. And when treatments share the same letter, in the case of the buffer and the control in all these panels, that means there's no significant difference between those treatments. And we also see greater concentrations of a suite of different heavy metals as well, such as lead, nickel, copper, and cadmium in that impact zone closer to the man-made structures after the production of oil. But what is the impact, the ecological impact of those chemical changes? Well, we can see in terms of the biomass and diversity of the system that there are also responses. So the total abundance of benthic invertebrates decreases in the impact zone relative to both the buffer and the control. So we're getting fewer benthic invertebrates respective of the species. But we also see that average body mass decreases. So that's really interesting because it suggests that it's larger organisms that are particularly suffering, if you like, in the close proximity to the man-made structures as a result of this chemical concentrations increasing. And we also see reductions in both the species richness and evenness of the benthic invertebrate community, which are both components of alpha diversity, if you like, declining as a result of these man-made structures. But let's look a little bit more about what's happening throughout the food web then. Is it just biomass and diversity metrics that are changing? Well, I talked about how body size on average decreases, and it's really interesting that this follows through and that we get a reduction in the mean trophic level of organisms within the food web, which means shorter food chains. And because larger organisms typically tend to be predatory, higher up the food web, as we lose those larger predatory organisms, we're reducing food chain length, and that's what becomes apparent in this mean trophic level declining. And to sort of support that as well, if we look at the vulnerability, the average vulnerability of a species within the food web, it's actually decreasing as well because there are fewer predators eating other species, if you like, in these simpler food webs. We also see that there are fewer links within the food web, but an interesting thing is that the fewer species that remain are more connected to one another. So the average connectance or complexity of the remaining species actually increases. And that suggests that it's particularly dietary specialist species that are being lost, and that dietary generalists are a little bit more robust to these kind of anthropogenic stresses. And interestingly enough, a more connected food web does suggest that those hardy organisms that remain are probably going to be more resilient to further perturbations that they might encounter. So I guess to try and sum up some of those results, we see clear chemical impacts within 500 meters of man-made structures. There are ecological consequences with lower diversity within 500 meters, and particularly larger invertebrates being found to be more susceptible to these impacts. We see shorter food chains and fewer interactions within the food web, but also food webs that are more connected within the 500 meters close to man-made structures after the production of oil. And I suppose just to say that this is really a first step on the FewComs project to understand the impacts of man-made structures. Some of our ongoing work looks at the response of fish communities and their diets as well, to move beyond just the benthic invertebrates, those organisms living within the sediments. And we're also carrying out mesocosm experiments to disentangle the relative contribution of different hydrocarbons, heavy metals, and other potential stressors. And a very important part of some of our upcoming work is also analyzing temporal trends to try and determine the duration and the legacy of these impacts. And I suppose to sort of touch on that with some hot off the press results, if you like, maybe from a policy perspective, you'll say, oh, well, is it really interesting that we realize as oil production commences that, you put some nasties into the environment and there are negative ecological responses. What happens after we decommission these structures? And this is some of the early results that Zelen has produced, looking at that same experimental design, if you like, of comparing impact, buffer, and control zones, but this time between active and decommissioned structures from those same data bases that we have access to. And early indications are that decommissioning may lead to some amelioration of effects. So we see what was a negative effect of active structures on the abundance of benthic invertebrates seems to disappear within decommissioned structures. And there's also some reduction in the extent of loss of species richness close to structures after decommissioning as well. But there are a lot of questions to unpack yet about how long after decommissioning before we see these effects occurring. Do they only occur with full removal of the structure, or maybe they're worse with full removal of the structure? And of course, a whole suite of other potentially confounding environmental factors as well that we need to take more account of within our analyses. But keep an eye on this for more updates in the coming future. And just to say a big thank you to the wider FUCOMS team as well, from not just in Essex, but also across the other institutes involved, including VIA Denmark, SAM, St Andrews and CFAS. And thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Owen. Thank you very much. You've raised some really interesting research there and shared that, from your research team, acting as a great spokesman, as you said. Yes, it'd be interesting to see where the research goes, because I understand it's still underway as well. So these are some of the early results. Thank you. Okay, folks, at this point, I'm going to invite all of the other speakers back to the panel, please. And we have some questions for you. So I'll wait until we're all back on camera. We've also got the illustration as further developed a little bit, and I think we'll just keep that alongside too. So okay, our first question, if I can direct this to Ashlyn. So Ashlyn, Raphael and Nobili has a question around the introduction of the new environmental outcomes report, and that there's a sense that it could replace the standard EIA approach, and they're wondering how that aligns perhaps with the MMO goals going forward. Oh, unmute Ashlyn.
Yeah, just realized that. Managed to undo my video, but not my sound. Thanks very much. It's a good question. And it's an important question, given what we've been trying to say about how connected things are, how integrated they need to be, and the system. So in terms of the MMO goals, which the MMO published last year, we're aiming for something that does integrate across the system and does move us towards taking all things into account while achieving some pretty difficult outcomes related to ecosystem function and biodiversity and people's well-being and their prosperity. So I think that's going to be a really big thing to achieve. And the way that we license, the way that we give out licenses and the conditions that we put on those licenses and the strategic objectives that we have around a licensing system and what that achieves is an important factor there. The two should be sitting side by side and work together. But I'm not sure that we're definitely going to be able to make that happen. We should, but because we haven't processed that yet, I don't know if we can. And then I think there's another part of this question, which is about the new environmental outcomes reporting and whether that will replace the standard EIA, and how that might or might not make a change in terms of what we're talking about here, cumulative effects. I think that there are really good aspects of environmental impact assessment, and not least the fact that we've been practicing it and working with it for a very long time. And at one level, it certainly works well, but there are things related to how we contextualize what's in that EIA and how we relate it to what's going on around that particular development and how we see it at a strategic level that maybe we aren't doing as well. Also, how integrated across all the particular perspectives and values and benefit distribution that we have, how that EIA works. So I think there's the short of all of this is I think there's a lot of work to do, and aligning up these things is an important part of that. And our system is a little bit fragmented, and I think whether we manage to achieve this alignment or not is up in the air. But I would like to be optimistic and hopeful about it, is what I'm going to say.
Thanks, Aisling. I think some of these things were touched on in Ed's talk as well, about all the various different ways of assessing and, an idea of trying to bring them all together. So I'll actually move on to Ed next. Ed, you got a question from Chris Leakey and Nature Scott. Chris is saying, so if I understand, you're suggesting that EIA level SEA should be nested under a strategic SEA level approach. So he's talking about marine plans, nesting an EIA approach within a more strategic SEA approach. He's asking, is it realistic in the short term? Is this realistic in short term or long term? Should we settle on an interim approach that's perhaps cruder and not reliant on cracking all the complexities that you touched on?
Yes, it's a simple answer. However, I think the key point is that we need a coherent approach that reflects both the ecological scales and the legislated obligations that we have. And that, I argue, requires a significant change in the EIA and SEA systems. Now, the question of pragmatism is hugely relevant, but if SEA was going to step into that place, it needs teeth. And I think EIAs at the moment are, and this is sort of experience beyond just the UK and things, but EIAs are one of the critical tools which is used to make decisions about individual developments. So if there's going to be something else that sits over that, an SEA type approach, then it needs to have teeth in terms of the decision-making process. And then just lastly, I think regarding complexity, the part that was fascinating about kind of sitting through it and working on that with that example of herring, the causal loop model, was then when you then start sort of like weighting and looking at the level of information you don't need information about everything. And you can sort of like have a slightly bespoke approach, but you need to have, I guess, that coherence of the underlying information. You need to have the sort of like the long-term data sets. You need to have an ability to bring what are sort of currently quite disparate data together to help you sort of build that picture. And that's the part where a kind of a strategic approach, which is a process, I think. It's not just about sort of like one-off assessments. I think there needs to be some sort of underlying process that's able to use that information that can be used by those kind of discrete assessments. But again, it's just that point that there needs to be something which is enabling that information to feed back and forth between the two. It's iterative. It's never going to get answered in one go. The change, and as I said, I think in the conclusion, the key challenge, I think, for me is that this is more of a political issue than a sort of a scientific issue.
Really interesting, Ed. We've actually got a follow-on question, which has actually been asked, well, all the panelists. So Ed, you've said it perhaps more of a policy political kind of thing. Dick and Howells asked all the panelists, do you think it's policy, regulatory framework, or on the other side, is it the supporting evidence that is the main challenge for delivering effective cumulative effects assessments? I could go around you all. I think maybe ask Tony.
Sure. Yeah, thanks for the question, Dickon. So, yeah, I mean, I think to an extent, Ed's comment was about the complexity as part of the challenge, and one of the things, particularly with cumulative effects assessment, is really trying to understand the pressure state relationships, and being able to quantify those is extremely difficult because of all of these synergies, whether the interactions between pressures and environmental state are synergistic, antagonistic, or some other form, additive, multiplicative. We just, it becomes so complicated, and I myself have done a number of these sorts of horrendograms trying to work out what those interactions are. And the problem is you pull one lever and you're going to affect another. And often we don't know what that effect is likely to be. So trying to undertake a holistic approach to trying to come out with the best outcome is probably undoubtedly going to have a degree of trade-off associated with it, and ultimately I think that then becomes the MMO or JNCC or whoever's remit to then make a decision about what they're willing to live with, I think, in terms of what those outcomes are. And I suspect the consensus isn't always going to be one that everybody agrees with, but we'll have to, it'll be a case of trying to move in a particular direction rather than actually trying to specify a particular outcome. And I think that's where, from a political perspective, it can become quite challenging, because those ministers and those individuals who are then making decisions about what they want, what outcomes they wish to show as an outcome, can be somewhat opaque, I think, and that's part of the challenge. And ultimately the work that myself and colleagues are trying to do is trying to look at directions of travel rather than necessarily say remove this pressure and you're going to get 50 more fish. So it's that I think that's part of the challenge. So I think it's not that the policy framework is necessarily fully developed yet. I think it probably needs tweaking and work moving towards that, but also I think our approach to trying to quantify cumulative effects is also challenging. So I think it's a little bit of both.
Yeah. It's a very, very good answer, very balanced answer. Any other reflections across the panel?
I think I just quickly pitch in, it's just to effectively agree with what Anthony was just saying there. I think it's a bit of both, that you need to have that coherent policy that's sort of enabling, because there is a lot of complexity. There's always going to be more information that's going into it, and hopefully that evidence base will be improving as time goes on. But having that sort of overarching coherence of policy up at the top, so that information, that evidence is sort of being directed towards answering some of those policy questions.
Yeah, there's probably something that you're seeing quite a lot in your job as well, Ashlyn. Balance of the two is required, it seems.
Yeah, one of the things that's really on my mind is that it is a system, and you have to get all the parts of the system working really well. But one of the questions for me is how to, is the chicken and egg, which directs, which comes first. And I think that in some cases one or the other comes first, and that's okay. And we should be able to try and incorporate that into our behavior, into our structures, and into our decision making. And that's, I feel like, so there's almost a third part of this, which isn't just the evidence, and it isn't just the regulatory framework. It's about the behavior and the way that we process these kinds of complex things. And I increasingly, as I listen to the work that is going on in this program, what I think about is that we now are talking very regularly about a number of different frameworks which try to holistically take into account many variables and different perspectives and different values and different objectives. And I think that they are all trying to achieve a similar thing, and that what we need to do is see that wood for the trees and be able to agree that we're all trying to work towards the same thing. That although that looks very complex when you're down in the wood, actually once you're up above, that there is a simplicity to it, and that we could do that, but that requires self-reflection and change on how we operate. For instance, it was interesting listening to Tony there. I mean, he's absolutely right. The decisions are taken by the decision makers, but actually, is that the correct way for decisions to be made. And I'm not sure it is. I think that possibly deliberative participation is maybe more what we want. And that would mean that actually you would be in on the decision, and so would lots of other people. But that would be a real culture change for the regulatory framework. But I think that that's something we need to think about. We talk about ecosystem assessments. We talk about natural capital. I'm thinking a lot about the bow tie analysis as we're talking about this, that Adrian Judd talks about a lot, which comes into it. And for me, actually, I see all of that. There's huge detail and skill in all of that, but it's all the same thing. It's all trying to take into account multiple different bits. And that for me is what we need to fix. We need to fix our process so that we can do that really regularly. And that requires, fixing the way data is transmitted and analyzed and presented so that lots of different people can understand it. And that means getting the evidence all in as fast as we can, as often as we can. That requires a shared facilitation, a shared infrastructure, a shared architecture that we can all use. We need to be able to agree what our objectives are here. What are we all trying to achieve by this? And if we can do that, that's a really good start. That is certainly steered by government, but I think everybody should be able to have a say in that. And then in terms of our decision making, that process should not be opaque. I'm not saying it is opaque, but I'm just saying it should never be opaque. It should be really clear to people. They should be able to see how the decision is made so that they can trust it and also improve it and adapt it so that they can feed into that process. And at the moment, I'm not that sure that we have all of that. If we could get all of that going, then we might be able to say, we've got a regulatory framework, we've got a really good decision-making process, and we've got fantastic science and evidence, and the whole thing is connected up. And that means that we can evaluate as we go, maybe change what we want to change, maybe direct what evidence is produced, but also have the evidence feed back into what we're trying to do. There's the chicken and egg. Neither comes first. It's all part of the same system, I think.
So if I may just ask on that question, just to ask Aisling a question myself. Sure. I mean, to what extent though should we be really trying to make some of this decision and thinking even locally or from a UK or even England perspective that it should be apolitical? So actually it should be far more cross parliamentary decision making rather than individual decisions of the government of the day making decisions based on a single manifesto, because ultimately these challenges are something that face us all, both nationally and internationally.
I really agree with that, Tony, because I think also that gives it the kind of longevity you need when you're dealing with things like cumulative effects and the significance of those on the environment. So yes, and it's about that democratic process, which happens at all scales and all levels, and how we manage that, how we make it fair and open and transparent, which is why I think lots of people should be in on the decision making, but also how we build together that buy-in into what we're trying to achieve. We have huge problems with biodiversity. We have huge problems with how we're trying to deal with climate change and not doing that well, how we're trying to deal with economic problems, social deprivation. There's a lot of intersection here across the things that we're trying to achieve. And actually, I believe that cumulative effects should include all of that. We should be able to take all of that into account because it should be so multidisciplinary. And then we should be able to use that as a great evidence base for talking about these trade-offs that we have to make, which you mentioned.
Sort of widening out the cumulative effects assessment approach to include that third element, Aisling, which is about people and working more collaboratively together and involving more people in the cumulative decision making, perhaps, if you call it that. Some really, really great points, and you got lots of thumbs up on that and a few comments there. People really enjoying that discussion, and sort of moving away from a first come, first served scenario, something more holistic, I suppose. Lucy Skates is proposing. You mentioned, Aisling, about sort of other approaches that are being considered, including natural capital approaches, and I'd like to ask a question for Owen about the the food web approaches that your team are investigating also lend themselves to functional ecology and understanding the functions, which can then lead on to understanding ecosystem services that are provided. And from the research you've got going on in your team, do you think that's where the science can go, and then you can be in a position to provide sort of that type of information that can feed in to wider cumulative effects assessments in future?
I mean, yes, absolutely. So I guess one of the key approaches within the FewComps project that I didn't get to talk about today are some of the microbial techniques that that we're putting in place, and that's trying to understand the microbial communities that are associated with different components of the carbon and nitrogen cycle, so that you can understand changes in genes that might be associated with the breakdown of ammonia or nitrates, key parts of the nitrogen cycle that provide nutrients for other higher level organisms that maybe we might have more of a commercial interest in, or the carbon cycling that might lead to sequestration versus emission of carbon into the atmosphere. And so, you know, we're doing a lot of work to try and disentangle which particular contaminants or which particular physical stressors in terms of bioturbation might be altering some of these like key microbial processes that can provide important ecosystem functions or services, like the nutrient cycling and carbon cycling, I guess, that can have much bigger effects beyond the local environment that they're influencing.
Yeah, great. There's a follow-on question building on that I've got for Tony. But I think first, while we've got you there, Owen, there's a question from the audience about whether some of the samples that you're collecting are having invasive and non-native species in them. And, you know, are you finding perhaps in the more stressed elements of the habitat that it is including these invasive non-native species? Are they coming in with a potential change of habitat?
We actually haven't specifically looked at that yet, but it's a really interesting point. And I think that's something that gives me something to take back, as that could be quite a neat angle to try and focus in on, to try and understand which sorts of species are benefiting versus, you know, suffering as a result of some of the contamination that we're seeing. What I would say, though, is that Zelen has done some random forest modeling to try and understand which species are the key indicators or responders, I guess, to the treatments. And that could be positive or negative. And across, you know, sort of the top 20 species that are really responding strongly to these effects, we don't see any obvious non-native species. They're things that are already there that are showing big changes in abundance or potentially disappearing out of the system. And you know, there's certainly some winners, and that's typically in terms of the detritivores within the sediment. So probably benefiting from a lot of the new decomposition opportunities that arise from other organisms that might be suffering, and we see some, you know, filter feeders in particular that might like cleaner water and for filtering organic substances are some of those that respond most negatively. But typically it's the in situ native species that we see as the strongest responders. But certainly that's something that I'll take back and try and dig a little bit deeper into, because it's a very interesting point.
Yeah, great. And it's worth stressing that the samples and the data that you presented are all based on informal sedimentary sampling, not necessarily what's living on the sediments.
Living on the sediment as well. So they're from grab samples. So, you know, we get sort of echinoderms and decapods that would be, you know, sort of living above the sediment as well. So not just the infauna. So yeah, mixture of the two. Good.
Thanks for clarifying that. But go back to the ecosystem services. You know, it's interesting, the services that, you know, that you're starting to investigate. And if we think about some of the work that you're doing, Tony, and Nadia Papadopoulou, if I'm saying that correctly, apologies if not. Yeah, great. Has an interesting point about adding the benefits well, or rather considering the benefits that are there coming from, I suppose, ecological wins in and around the structures. And ecosystem services can be considered a part of that. And Nadia's making a point. Are there obvious benefits, clear benefits? Your presentation did show kind of a clear side that was, these are your pros and these are your cons as such. But in terms of ecosystem services now, are there services there that are coming out that might be beneficial at the site level?
Yeah, Yasu, Nadia, have a long time no see. From back in ODEM days. So yeah, absolutely. We're actually part of the project that we're working on with Dreams. Actually, has been looking at linking outcomes to ecosystem services as well. And there's, like you say, there was a number of pressures and effects which were considered to be desirable from not just from an environmental perspective, but as an ecosystem service outcome as well. So, I mean, particularly in the US, I mean, the main driver for the Rigs to Reef program is one of the answers, and one of the questions that actually was asked earlier. I answered offline. Sorry, it's in the answered questions there. Was the main driver for that was really for kind of biomass and primary productivity, primarily driven by sport fishing and in those areas, but subsequently has evolved to be looking as protection of habitat through de facto MPAs and actually enhancing biomass in those systems, which ultimately potentially could lead to greater stability of stocks and biomass limits and so on. So there may very well be, and certainly there is a number of arguments for why those structures potentially, if they were to be retained in some form, could actually lead to enhanced ecosystem services. And that ultimately becomes the question. I guess probably some of the arguments for why some people don't want them to be retained are similarly, we've already touched on kind of invasive species, and particularly the role of these hard structures in a typically soft sediment environment, and how they could be used as stepping stones for invasion for non-natives, which we know has a huge financial cost to industry, but also to biodiversity as well. So again, the bottom line is yes, we can identify both changes in ecosystem services as a result of different decommissioning options. And again, it becomes a trade-off about which of those services do we want to maintain, to enhance, or even to lose. And that, and one thing I guess I want to kind of make clear, I suppose, is the presentation I make is that whilst the kind of the general consensus was to kind of move away from a complete removal kind of scenario, at the same time, there is concern from the scientists that were involved in these meetings about the kind of the ethical kind of dilemma about leaving these structures in place. Aside from, yes, they could have some environmental benefits, in some form, but there is an ethical debate about take only photographs, leave no footprint type of outcome with respect to any of these structures. And it becomes, particularly if we're thinking about decarbonisation and the removal of oil and gas, but similarly we're putting in huge numbers of oil, offshore wind moving forwards. I mean, certainly there's one recommendation. I think the Crown Estate originally suggested 2,000 gigawatts by 2050 in order to meet net zero. That's 5,000 turbines a year until 2050 to meet that target. So, suddenly we're fundamentally changing what marine ecosystems look like and how they function in terms of a connectivity perspective, and then subsequent all the things that Owen has talked about in terms of the way in which our in fauna and systems from a primary productivity and turnover perspective also function. So yes, the answer, that was a long answer to the question. Yes, there is some benefits in the things that we have mapped, and we are currently mapping those, but there is also these costs. And I think again it becomes this decision about what do we want the outcome to look like, what do we consider to be sustainable, and that's the big elephant in the room, I guess.
Yes, and I mean, it raises the purpose behind a lot of the INSITE program projects, that they're providing the evidence and then sharing the evidence and making that available to decision makers to incorporate into that decision making process.
Yeah, I think Claire actually has got a hand up, actually, Henk, on the chat. Sostek, who's at PML and who's been leading on some of the ecosystem service stuff, so she may be able to comment if she is able to speak. I don't know, on some of those things.
I'm not sure we've got that. enabled, I'm afraid, Tony.
Okay,
So
no, that's fine. I mean, it may be worth it if you are interested in the work that PML leading on that aspect of the insight work that we are doing. Claire would be, and Steve Watson would be people to talk to.
Great, thank you. We've just got one last question. Owen, it's for you. It's from John Charlotte about they found a lack of basic information on the life histories of a lot of the benthic species, and that being a barrier to the analysis. Have you found that in your work so far?
I mean, certainly, it's, there's something like 5,000 species, I guess, in the extended databases that we're sort of working with, and such a high proportion of those, there's very little information on their some of the finer details of their life history. But what I would say is, like, we've tried to focus on broad characteristics, like body size and diet, which I guess it plays a big part of the functional role of organisms within communities. And Zelen, I guess, a large portion of his time so far has been dedicated to try and compile those data sets on those kind of key characteristics or traits of organisms. And whilst that means if you're interested in one particular species or group, maybe you don't fully understand all the dynamics of what's happening to them and why in response to some of these stressors. But it does allow us to have this broader perspective in understanding what types of organisms and what size classes of organisms, I guess, and which serve common roles, I guess, that are most affected to these higher level patterns or responses.
And thanks, Owen. Well, I think we're out of questions, and we're just about out of time as well. So if I can thank all of our speakers today for some great presentations, some great conversation as well, and for tackling all of those questions really well. I'd also like to thank our live illustrator, who has been listening to what we've been covering over the course of the webinar, and you can see for yourself how it's all developed. So this will be going up on the website fairly shortly, for the next couple of weeks, as will the recording of today's webinar. So that's looking great. And the final point I will leave you on. I can't seem to share my screen. All of the. Sorry, apologies. Just our next webinar. We are taking a short break over the summer, and we'll be back in late October for the 5th Insight webinar series into commercial fisheries. So just to let you know that's happening. And thank you everyone for attending today. Thank you for your questions, and have a great summer. Hope to see you the other side for the next webinar. Thank you. Bye-bye.